Thank you for watching and listening to this episode of the State of the Arc podcast. My name is Mike, and today, my co-host Kason and I will be beginning a multi-episode deep dive into the history of JRPGs, from their origins, through their golden years, and on to the present day. For this episode, we've brought on special guest Pat Holleman, author of the Reverse Design series and director of the recently released indie RPG Quartet. Pat has done extensive research into this topic while writing his book series, so I thought it would be a natural fit to bring him on. This episode is broken down into 3 parts, which you'll be able to see in the segmented timeline on YouTube or with time codes in the description. Part 1 goes over the coining of the term JRPG. When did we start using that term? Part 2 goes over the origins of the genre, how it got started in Japan and what influenced it. And Part 3 goes over the codifying of the formula of the genre, the games and publishers that essentially set the foundation for how these games would be made all the way into the present day. We hope that you enjoy it and look forward to the next part. If you appreciate content like this and would like to see us continue to make more, please support us on Patreon. Links are in the description. Thank you. There was a time in which, through the early to mid 2000s and maybe into the beginnings of the 2010s, where a lot of people kind of punched down, so to speak, at JRPGs, right? And so there's this idea that the term was coined as some sort of derogatory way to refer to these anime games, from Japan that are bad or whatever. This sentiment from like the mid 2000s. So you had I believe it was Naoki Yoshida or somebody from Square who said they don't like the term because they felt it was a derogatory term like that.
Interesting.
Personally, I don't agree with that framing for the reason the term was coined. There is evidence that this term was being used as early as 1992 from archived forum posts, long before the era, the mid-2000s, when all of this negativity about JRPGs even came about. That said, it's definitely true that there was a perception in the West, one that was widely spread in the mid-2000s, that Japanese RPGs were falling behind, or that they were failing to evolve or change in a way that was meaningful or fresh. This was pushed in a big way by a BioWare developer, I believe, and it was something that I saw widely shared as an opinion between a lot of players during that kind of PS3 era.
Well, it is often the case that things are named by their adversaries, actually. So this goes way back. This includes like religions, like Calvinism was not called so by Calvin. It was called that by the people who didn't like him and was kind of derogatory. Same thing with Lutherans, same thing with Mormons, same thing, like all kinds of names. They're given to people by the people who disagree with them, and then it sticks and it gets adopted. That's just kind of how these things work. And I almost wonder if that was also like J-pop was becoming a well-known thing at the time
that they would use.
But whenever I heard J-pop from people around me at least 20 years ago, it was usually derogatory as well. It was usually like, oh, that's J-pop, meaning like junior
cheesy,
pop. Or like, lame, it's not as good. It's like a knockoff version of pop music.
That process you're talking about is what linguists call reanalysis.
Oh, yeah.
So the most famous example is Watergate, and then everything became gate. Like all scandals for the government.
Everything's a gate.
It was Gamergate. It's Pizzagate. It's what was it? The New England Patriots. Spygate.
Oh, Spygate.
Yeah.
So what happened was there was a break-in at the Watergate Hotel. Then so that became the Watergate scandal. But everyone knows that water and gate don't go together in normal speech. They can do in this proper name, but they don't go together. And so they think of like water and gate as these separate things. Oh, attaching gate to something makes it a scandal.
Well, people assume that it's like a CIA operation, like Operation Watergate, right? Which it may have been, but that's not. It's just the name of the hotel. It was called the Watergate Hotel. But I feel like people don't really know that. They just hear Watergate, and then that's pretty funny.
But there was a term. So the interesting thing is the term JRPG came to inherit a mantle of a genre that did exist, which is the console RPG. Japan was doing all of their RPG creation basically on computers. or on consoles rather. And where in the West, we were doing it almost entirely on PC, except
That's
for
a
a
shame.
brief
And they were
burst
probably a
of-
little more complex. I know the Japanese RPGs, in order to make them fit a console, simplified things quite a bit.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
I wonder if that's a big difference too.
that's actually going to be a super, super important point in the history and development of the JRPG, which is that it was on console, and so it had to make certain sacrifices. And my overarching statement, having written many books about the history of game development now, is that if you could summarize game development in one sentence, it would be technical constraints create artistic styles.
Very nice. I love it.
And so
Love it.
that'll be a big theme that we're going to see emerge from the history of the JRPG.
Yeah. People were using the term JRPG in forums and things like that long before it was sort of co-opted, like you said. It took on a new mantle of meaning when there was this shift in how people in the West were viewing JRPGs, and maybe became for a period of time something like a derogatory term to throw around. That's why it was so confusing to me, because I know that I was using that term way before it became seen as this term. So it's so surprising. It's like, wait, JRPG is like a slur? Like, what are we talking about? Like, me and all of my buddies who loved JRPGs were referring to it with love and reference way before you guys came in here and started using it this way. So anyway, I just wanted to like get that part of it out of the way. Like, not only do I understand that that's the case, or that's how it's viewed by some people, but there's merit to this idea that it is somehow like a derogatory term. I don't think it is anymore, as in like now in like the 2020s. But maybe for a time it was kind of viewed that way.
This might be also a reason why Yoshida maybe doesn't love the category, is that it becomes a constraint. It becomes some boundaries around them that they didn't make, that other people are imposing on them. If they decide to experiment or go outside the rules, it's like, what? This isn't what a JRPG is supposed to be. And it's like, we never said, you made up JRPG. We are just making games that we like, and you're imposing these boundaries on us that are constricting our freedom in a way that like we are confined to do whatever the cultural zeitgeist has determined is or is not a JRPG. When it's like, no, we're just making the next Final Fantasy game. Don't give us another box. I mean, that's how the world works. Like, we put things in boxes, we categorize, and then some become popular, and they are constraints. They do act as constraints, but they don't need to. And I see the artists themselves probably being a little upset at the additional constraints other than the ones the CEO puts on them. Now the fans have put them in this new box that they can't get out of. So artists don't like that.
There's 2 points on that I think are really interesting. There were lots of other terms way before that, even in Japan, that were doing exactly the same thing of putting something in a box like you're talking about. Basically, the same way as like in the early 90s and maybe late 80s, that playing video games became synonymous with the word Nintendo, right? Playing Nintendo. Turn the Nintendo off, your mom would say, and it's a PlayStation or something like that. It didn't matter what the platform was. It was playing Nintendo, right? Nintendo just became the word for video games.
Sort of like how Band-Aid or Kleenex became ubiquitous, even though they're brands. They became ubiquitous for the product itself. Exactly. Any tissue is a Kleenex.
Dragon Quest was that in Japan.
That's right.
They called anything that looked or felt like Dragon Quest Dorakue. As in Dragon Quest games, like
so it's
shortened together.
Dora from Dragon and Kue from Quest. And then Doragon Kue Suto. It would just became Dorakue. Which I think is cool. I love how Japan does that.
So like, Final Fantasy gets released, Phantasy Star gets released. They're calling these Dorakue games, right? So they had the same thing even there. So it's a natural thing to happen. I understand that there's maybe some negative sentiment for the term for a brief period of time.
But it's
definitely
overcome.
Not that way anymore.
I don't think so.
But let's actually talk about the interesting part, which is not that. What is the actual distinction?
We've heard one distinction being console versus PC, and that's pretty good.
That's a big one.
It gets us like 70% of the way.
It's particularly in the early years. It's more true in the early years than it is maybe now, because everything's on PC and consoles now.
Right.
But my first note here was to talk about Dungeons and Dragons. You can't begin defining what an RPG is without Dungeons and Dragons.
Dungeons and Dragons occupies a really unique place among art forms in general. It's very rare for a new medium to come out, and for the first example of that medium to do everything that the medium can do. It would be like if, in the 1400s when they first started using polyphony and different scales in music, right? And like, we've now invented the modern form of Western music. And then Beethoven's Ninth came out a decade later. That's the sort of relationship that D&D would have with its art form, their RPG. By 1981, with AD&D, almost everything that an RPG could do, D&D already did. Gary Gygax took the idea, just went so crazy with it that it's almost impossible to imagine an artist doing more in his own form than Gygax did. And it wasn't always well implemented. And basically the entire history of Dungeons and Dragons since 81 has been people trying to streamline and make accessible ideas that first appeared in the AD&D manuals, because almost everything that ever existed appeared there. And this is actually something that I can claim this, but Shannon Appelcline actually said this more or less the same thing in his review of the tabletop genre, is that there was only really one design idea that D&D didn't do that Traveller, another tabletop RPG, did, which was skill-based EXP progression. So like, instead of leveling up your character, you level up your skills. And so like, but 99% of ideas were already in D&D. And that has artistic impacts, right? Which is that, oh, geez, what do we do now, right? Like, we can make, a cyberpunk version of a tabletop RPG, or we can make,
outer space,
something that's less Tolkien-esque and more something like Moorcock, which is actually essentially what Final Fantasy was originally, right? Because Sakaguchi was a Moorcock fan. But if, aside from changing the style of the fiction, like, what do we do? And they had good answers for that eventually. But there was also like the technical aspect, which is that even to this day, no computer can do everything that is in the 1981 AD&D manual.
Really?
Right? It's just not possible.
Yeah.
Not possible. I mean,
That's
there's
really
so many things that would require simulation. And the DM is the biggest thing, right? Because the DM can fluidly change the story, but the AD&D has ways of doing that. It has tables, it has methods, it suggests things, like the Dungeon Master's Guide, right? It's not like a set of rules exactly. It is, but it's a teaching tool to tell the DM how to play, and how to be flexible and how to think like a dungeon master, so that you can change the experience, and every experience can be unique. And unique experiences are just not something that computers do well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So every digital RPG creator that has ever lived has been wrangling with the legacy of D&D, and that it was artistically very complete, but also completely impossible to totally replicate in the digital sphere. And I don't want to go too deep into, without prompting, but to how digital game or RPG designers handled this. But just in general, they had three strategies, and JRPGs were one of the products of one of those strategies. So that's sort of the legacy of the tabletop.
Basically, every RPG that exists today in digital form, as Pat is talking about, was derived from Dungeons and Dragons, which was released in 1974.
51 years ago.
And
Wild.
Immediately after that, there were a lot of attempts to try to digitize that idea, that game experience. How can we make a computer game from the basic sort of rule set of Dungeons and Dragons?
Yeah, basically immediately after that, no time. Like the ink was still wet on the paper before the nerds that were into D&D were also into computers and decided to start using all of the resources that they had in order to make like text adventures based on D&D. It was like possibly that same year, but at the very least by the year later, 1975, there were several of them already in circulation.
So when you're thinking about what is a role-playing game, when you're going all the way back to its origins in D&D, these are games where players assume the roles of characters in a fictional setting. that's just part one. Of course, if that were it, then like every game's an RPG.
Yeah,
right?
I remember when I was in like third grade, and I told my teacher that I was playing an RPG because I discovered Mario RPG, and she was like, "What does that mean?" I said, "It's a role playing game," and she thought she knew what I was talking about because role playing is a pedagogical technique.
Yeah.
It's like she had learned it in school, I guess, and so she started to talk to me, and it's an early memory that I have actually. She started to tell me about playing a role, and you have a game where you play a role. And I like games like that and kind of thing. And I gave her the weirdest look. And she didn't connect with me at all. I was like, no, it's where you have hit points and you like kill monsters and you like have defensive stats. That's what an RPG is. Like, what are you talking about, lady? And for some reason, I still remember that. I go back to that. I think about that often now, as I was like, there's a huge disconnect based on the fact that role-playing game does not mean role-playing game.
Yeah.
Right? We're talking about two very different things.
Exactly. That's a really funny story. So it's a game where you assume the role of a character and you make decisions that affect the story or your own character's development, right?
Yeah.
This is essentially what D&D is. You're passing the turn from player to player, and they make decisions about what they want to do given what the situation is.
In which case, most JRPGs are not RPGs.
Well, and we'll get to it. So this is where we're beginning to draw that line or that distinction, right?
Yeah.
So additionally, one sort of foundational feature of the wider genre is this idea of stat-based character progression. So your characters grow stronger by leveling up, which increases the attributes, the statistical attributes of that character. My strength is at level 12, and I leveled up, and now it has gone up, which increases my attack power.
There's like a multiplier. Right. There's some rules. Yeah.
And so like as you level up those statistical numeric attributes,
right,
your character's output in terms of damage or success rate in different skill checks,
dexterity,
goes up.
Yeah.
So those two things, I think, would be kind of the way you would define an RPG going back to D&D. Now, as we were just saying, there are many D&D nerds who were also computer nerds. So they immediately kind of tried to take that hobby and create products, games that they, would be able to use like the basic ideas. But a lot of those games, this was something that was very interesting, and this goes back to the distinction you're talking about between the console and the PC RPGs of the 80s. They were much more complex than you realize.
That's what surprised me about diving back into these old games, or diving for the first time into these old games going way back. They were way complex. In fact, I think game developers of today have to play Ultima 1 or some of these old games in order to realize that it's not that things started simple and became more complex. It's actually kind of the opposite for this specific genre, at least. That things started very complex and gradually became more and more simplified over time. And that there's a lot of good ideas that no games do today that existed in the 70s that have just kind of been left by the wayside because no modern games do it. And there was so much complexity. There were so many options. There's so much that you can do, so many stats and so many different things in all of these old games that are just kind of ignored now. But it's all in favor of just a few stats now. It's built down to basically like 4.
Yeah, and that was due to the fact that the NES ended up being the platform that exploded,
2 buttons,
which had 2 buttons and a D-pad and the start and select button. And so they had to be simplified for that interface the player has with the game in terms of navigating menus and making choices and things of that nature. But in the early 80s, almost all RPGs were made for PCs. Personal computers.
The NEC PC 8801 or something like that.
Yeah.
Many of them were made for mainframes at universities.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah,
that's
not personal computers, but like these, like big, giant freaking machines.
That only exist at universities, back in the day.
Yeah, so you can go to a computer lab and play Rogue with your friends, or Angband. The David Brevik, the creator of Diablo, talks about that. That's like one of his essential experiences, playing Moria and Angband at the computer lab at San Diego State.
Yeah.
But that was the primary way that people did it. And writing those RPG engines for the mainframe was something that university administrators didn't always appreciate.
Oh, I'm sure that's true.
Which is is why we don't have a lot of those games anymore. Like, they got discovered by the administrators and deleted. And like the first ever RPG, like nobody knows when or who made the first ever technical one of these. It just, a bunch of students were doing it, and basically they're all deleted from history now.
Yeah, so they're all being made for PCs. Well, it becomes for PCs originally on the mainframes, like you're saying. But as personal computers started to become a thing in the early 80s, the Apple II, and
PC
then in
88.
Japan, they had a bunch of different ones. The PC 8000 series, the MSX, a bunch of different stuff. But as these started becoming popular, these D&D nerds saw the opportunity. Well, I could make a game and like sell it on this platform, right? But here's the really interesting part. When we say all RPGs are derived from Dungeons and Dragons, that is true. But Dungeons and Dragons did not release in Japan until like 1985.
Yeah, officially.
Yes.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's right.
There were some examples, and I have some quotes for this, where a developer who worked at Koei or maybe Namco or something in the early 80s went to America on like a business trip and then bought the game there and brought it back before its official Japanese release. But for the most part, these guys in Japan, these computer nerds who were, learning to code on these early PCs, were not influenced directly by Dungeons and Dragons, but rather by these games made by the nerds who played Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, that's right.
There are a few extremely notable examples that are referenced in every interview I've ever read from an early JRPG creator.
It's always the same games.
Yes.
It's the same handful of games.
So you have Richard Garrett, who created Ultima. And before Ultima, Akalabeth. But Ultima 1 through 3 were major, gigantic influences on creators like Hironobu Sakaguchi, creator of Final Fantasy, or Yuji Horii, the creator of Dragon Quest.
Satoru Iwata, Shigeru Miyamoto talks about basing Legend of Zelda off of Ultima.
Yeah. Then you have Andrew Greenberg, who created Wizardry, came out in 1981. This is another one that you will hear in basically every early JRPG interview in terms of like the creation of the game. It's Ultima and Wizardry. We were inspired by Ultima or Wizardry or
Wizardry.
both.
Yeah.
Usually both of them.
Both.
Now, the reason is because in Ultima's case, we'll put some footage of this on the screen, you have this sort of like overworld map exploration where you go from the main sort of like world map into a town tile. Right, and then you go into the town and you go and explore that.
Revolutionary
dungeon.
For the time,
and also its dungeon crawling aspects and things like that.
Yeah.
So you have that, which gets combined with this game Wizardry, which has things like random encounters and turn-based menu, like command-based combat.
That's right. And party, multiple character party.
Like multiple characters in your party. So, and the dungeon crawling aspects of both.
That's right. Yeah, they both have
these
that.
two games, if you go back and play Ultima 1 and Wizardry, you basically see the foundation for everything we love in sort of the modern landscape of JRPGs to some degree. Those guys were inspired by D&D, and every PC RPG maker of the 80s was inspired by them.
Yeah, that's right.
Pretty much directly.
Yeah.
So that's where like the true beginnings, like the real like roots, essentially, of what became the RPG began. Then you have a guy named Hank Rogers, who is a Dutchman, but made a game.
H-E-N-K.
Yeah, H-E-N-K. Who made a game called The Black Onyx.
Yes.
In Japan. This is why this is so messy in terms of how do you define like what a JRPG is and what was the first JRPG? Because many of the things we associate, like the design, sort of like philosophically, came from Western-derived PC RPGs in the early 80s.
Yeah.
One of the most influential games in Japan. So like the Black Onyx was like the first, I would say, pretty successful, like widely successful RPG, PC RPG in Japan.
Yes, and JRPGs are based on the Black Onyx.
Yes.
And it was made by a Dutch American
who
did not speak Japanese. The rumor is he he was like, he liked a girl or something like that. He liked a Japanese girl.
Yep.
So he went over to Japan to meet with this girl and ended up just like trying to find work. And he made this game. And I don't know who. Okay, in as I played the Black Onyx, it's the very first time I saw Arimasu written in katakana and not hiragana. Or it's really funny. It's very interesting to play these old games because they don't use kanji.
Yeah.
Much. They use some, but they don't use much.
They actually started doing that in the Super Nintendo era a lot because they wanted
resolution.
to help with like the text limitations. They wanted to say more with less.
Oh, perfect. There you go. Yeah.
So like Dragon Quest, for instance, like 1 and 2 on the Super Nintendo, the Super Famicom, has a ton of kanji in it, whereas the NES versions did not. The text was really different.
The kanji, it can sometimes actually be harder to read the pure katakana without the reference of the kanji sometimes. But yeah, in some ways, I don't know who if he didn't speak Japanese, I don't know who translated that game for him. But there's not a ton of text in the game. Yeah. In fact, this is another big thing about these old games. It's the manual is where all of the story and all of the setting and a lot of the directions and instructions and what to do and which commands are valid and which ones aren't. Because in a game with a lot of command prompts, you don't know, like open door, like invalid prompt. Like,
right, you're actually typing
like,
in.
Okay, like turn doorknob, touch doorknob. Like how do I open the door? You know, and sometimes it's just a letter, but often the instruction manual will tell you these are. And there's a set one, but sometimes from game to game they can change, right, as to which ones you can do, how to reference all these things using your keyboard. Sometimes it's just the first letter of the item that you're wanting to do, and then the direction controls too. Sometimes it's the number keypad. As to and that had the added benefit of being able to go diagonally as well in certain games because you have the 1 and 3 are like up and left and up and to the right. But the game manual is how they saved a lot of text for the game itself. So when you're actually playing the game itself, there's not a ton of text. So it's possible that Hank sort of just learned a few Japanese words and kind of was able to make the game based on that. There is still more dialogue than that, but it's not much.
Yeah, that's another really interesting point you bring up, and we're getting on a tangent a little bit, but I love it anyways. When I was replaying the NES Dragon Warrior for the video we did a couple weeks ago, and I started looking through the actual physical manual, there's so much of the story of that game that is put in that.
That's so funny.
This idea that the game and the manual were very essential companion pieces was exactly due to what you're talking about. It's like whatever limitation we have in terms of the amount of text and the file size of this thing that went onto a giant floppy disk, and they had multiples of those for Ultima. I think the Ultima games had like multiple disks you had to like insert.
Oh,
like
that's right.
Disks, right.
Well, different scenarios or whatever. But when he would sell, or his first game, Akalabeth, before Ultima, he had like a Ziploc bag with the floppy disks in it, and he had like 100-page manual that went in the thing with it as well.
Yes.
And you need that.
You need it.
You need all of it.
Because a lot of the story is in those manuals too, as well, of course, as like helping you understand how to play the game.
Yeah.
But those three, so we have Wizardry and Ultima, and then the Black Onyx. So
which
Wizardry
is pretty close to Wizardry, I think, Black Onyx.
It's very similar.
Yeah.
But Wizardry and Ultima for setting the like design foundation.
Right.
Black Onyx because it was such a big commercial success in Japan in particular. Those three end up becoming sort of what influenced Japanese creators to start making their own similar kinds of games.
So those three games are all examples of what we call simplifications of D&D. So like if you think of, we can't make D&D, right? It can't happen. So what are we going to do instead? Well, some designers, especially in the early 80s, most designers making Ultima, Black Onyx, Wizardry, they said, okay, we're going to do as many D&D things as we can, but we're going to simplify those mechanics so that they'll fit on a PC or a mainframe in many cases. And so that's a really important thing to understand about as we come up to early Final Fantasy is that the early Final Fantasies were just simplifications of D&D. They were trying to do as much of D&D as they could, and it wasn't a lot. And if you especially go like Ultima, like the mechanics are dumbed down immensely. And that's because he had to. That's what Gary had to. But that's the kind of RPG that was popular basically everywhere. It's the big style of RPG was this simplification of style of RPG based on D&D, trying to do as much as possible.
Yeah. So we kind of understand like how the RPG genre sort of gets introduced to Japan and maybe some of its most early influences. But when you try to break down, okay, like what's the first JRPG? This is where it becomes like extremely difficult and muddy, partly because of what you said. There's a lot of those games that are totally abandoned where nobody knows it exists. The other part of it is the records. Like we don't know the precise dates of release for certain things or others.
You would have to like look into like people's journals, like after they pass and like, oh, it turns out we all thought this game came out in 82. Turns out this journal entry from December of 81 references it. Not possible. Like we won't, it's just impossible to know. But even without like, I don't know, maybe in 100 years, some historian will discover when it was actually written based on reading his grandma's journal or something like that. But also these games, even the big ones that were made by like Koei or some of these older, studios, they were likely based on other people themselves, other than maybe just Wizardry or Ultima.
Yes.
Like maybe there was a high schooler who programmed a game and, we don't have it anymore, but he influenced the guy who eventually made like Dragon and the Princess or something like that. Yeah. In which case, like we don't have the original, we just have what we have.
Yes.
And you can never say for sure that it came first, but it is, at least we're talking, these are among the first.
Yes. So aside from it being imprecise in terms of how the history of it is recorded, additionally, you have this essentially emerging new genre. And people didn't just like wholesale pick that up and be like, I'm going to make a role-playing game. That term wasn't even like
it came
really
later.
Officially in the zeitgeist, so to speak, of the time. It came later. But you had other things like text-based adventures or simulation type games, as they called them, that were kind of in that vein. And they say, oh, what if we combine like certain aspects of this new hit game, Ultima, into our simulation text-based game, The Dragon and Princess, 1982. But do you call that a role-playing game officially, or is that more text-based adventure with some light role-playing elements, right? So there's like room for debate on whether that's truly an RPG in and of itself. And so like it's a little bit muddy, but certainly whatever the first JRPG was, it was released in the early 80s on one of these Japanese personal computers, of which there were many, many, many different brands.
Yeah.
But here's a list of a few that are up for contention for that. And you'll notice that most of these were developed by Koei. Koei was sort of like the trailblazing publisher in terms of like trying to latch onto this new emerging thing and make something out of it as a commercial product. So you have The Dragon and Princess in 1982 by Koei. You have Underground Exploration. Of course, some of these games were titled in English, but Underground Exploration was called Chite Tanken.
Chite Tanken, yeah.
In 1982, that was by Koei. Spy Daisakuzen. By Pony Canyon, so that one's not Koei. But then you have Seduction of the Condominium Wives, 1983 by Koei.
That one's...
Look this up. It's freaking funny.
I've seen that. It's really funny. It seems to be a take on the word condom being in condominium.
Yes,
However, but the game is in Japanese. So it's like, I think, anyways, it's really funny.
There were a lot of like erotic type games in these early PC.
This is another thing, but when you talk about role playing, sometimes you can easily find yourself in an erotic situation.
Then you have Sword and Sorcery or Kento Maho in 1983. That was Koei as well. Dungeon, this was a really big one. This was very wizardry inspired by Koei in 1983. Panorama To, 1983. This is Neon Falcom, which, if you're a big fan of The Legend of Heroes, Trails in the Sky, and Trails of Cold Steel, this was kind of their origins. And Neon Falcom developed Panorama To, which isn't itself an action RPG per se. I don't think if you've played that game, you could really call it that. But there are elements there that led into games like Dragon Slayer and then later Ys, which were hugely influential in sort of codifying what the action JRPG would become. They tried to take like an action bend to that. So you start to see this two forms of the JRPG almost birthed at the same time. You have your command-based, turn-based RPGs, which were like much more following the format of Ultima and Wizardry. And then you had Panorama To, which led to Dragon Slayer, which led to Ys, which was this action arcade style with some elements lifted of the statistical progression of characters that led to what we call the action RPG today.
I have a question for Pat now, because you just brought up arcade, and I don't know why I didn't even think of that in all of my research up to this point. We mentioned the console PC distinction, but when you're bringing things to arcade, imagine a text-based arcade game. You can't, can you? So, Pat, what effect did bringing these types of games to arcade have on the formation of JRPGs as we know them today?
There's a whole, I talked about how there's 3 strategies for dealing with D&D. And in the arcade, you see another one of them, right? You have the simplification, which is the big PC games. But in the arcade, in a very limited way, you see the combination strategy. And Mike's already talked about this a little bit, which is, you have a little bit of RPG sprinkled onto an action game or a dating sim or something like that, right? That was the most prevalent form of RPG throughout the 80s. And probably up through the mid-90s even, which is that you just sprinkle just a tiny little bit of RPG elements on top of some other thing. And so you can get that with like something like Altered Beast or Golden Axe and things that appear in
Golden Axe is a total arcade game.
Yeah, I'd say Gauntlet too. Gauntlet really fits that description.
Yeah, and so you are gaining something that resembles a level in a very slimmed down way. And that was a conscious decision, right? Like, okay, let's give our players some upgrades. We're not just going to have them, lose lives. We're going to have them, instead, we're going to have them gain some stats, gain some items. And items are just another form of stats if they're not, if you don't lose them permanently. Like anything that's not a consumable, if it recharges, it's a level up. It's just a different form of level up.
Okay.
And so anything like that, like magic meters that recharge, things like that, that's all just what we call the combination style of RPG, which is combine, the parts of the RPG that can fit on a computer with a different style, usually action, which computers are very good at, right?
Yeah.
Computers are very, very good at action, and tabletops are not. To try and play like an action RPG on the tabletop. What would that even be?
How does that even go?
You got like paper footballs and stuff. Like I don't even know. But that's essentially what the second strategy that was popular very early on. You see it in the Dragon Slayer too, but that's what you would see in the arcades. Is just let's mix this cool genre of RPG. Let's mix the parts of it we understand and the parts of it that can really fit on a computer with something a known arcade genre that was a hit. And this was also a common strategy for other like console games, like Super Mario Bros. Took 2 console genres, the action and platforming genres, and smashed them together. Right. And all of a sudden you've got a new kind of thing that can sustain a game for 8 hours. So that was a known strategy in Japan at the time, and RPGs were no exception.
Yeah.
So this is what's wild about that is because we talk about bridging the PC to the console and the complexity of the PC, but the arcade, I almost wonder if we're talking about how to define JRPGs, I wonder if we're maybe underselling the importance of the arcade in this whole process as well.
If you've read my notes, you know that we will not.
Oh, good. Okay. Because this isn't something that I had thought about enough. Okay, very good. But in the West, arcades just weren't as popular as they were in Japan, especially around this time.
So the arcade influence on Japanese role-playing games, just role-playing games in Japan, period, was massive. Massive. And this is, if you're talking about the lineage of games like The Legend of Zelda, this is where it comes from. Shigeru Miyamoto plays Wizardry or the Black Onyx or something like that. There's another one, the Tower of Duraga,
yes.
that directly influenced Legend of Zelda.
Right.
Yeah. So there was very much this split that was beginning to happen, like I'm saying, where you get kind of your hardcore, more like tabletop-esque digital experience. But like at the same time, you're splitting off this other direction in Panorama To,
yeah.
And after that, Dragon Slayer. Those are arcade influenced because they wanted the fast-paced arcade action parts.
Right.
But there's this new emerging genre that we should be paying attention to. This is kind of cool.
And RPGs don't work well in arcades, right?
Well, here's a funny story. The reason why this would have become attractive, this idea of role-playing, because when the Black Onyx launched, In its first 2 months, it sold a total of 5 copies. It was not catching on.
So what did they do? How did they?
So Hank Rogers goes to like all of the PC magazines in Japan at the time.
Yeah.
He like sits down with them with a copy of his game and he says, okay, like I'm going to like help you create a character, right?
Oh,
Again,
yeah.
because Dungeons and Dragons was not officially released in Japan yet.
Right.
So this idea of role playing in the sense that he understood deeply is not something that like most people in Japan get yet.
Yeah.
So he's like physically sitting down with them at the game and being like, okay, let's name your character. And I'm going to like pick a picture that looks like you
Right.
to like represent who you are. And then, okay, like we've created you in the game now. Now go and explore it. And they just loved that idea. It was so novel to them. It's like, oh my,
Right.
this is amazing. So they all start writing these extensive articles in their magazines about Black Onyx. Next month it sells like 10,000 copies.
Yeah.
And then like by the following year,
I think
150,000.
got into hundreds, yeah.
150,000 copies sold.
That's
So
crazy.
that's what it took for him to like help people who would cover and help market the game understand the appeal of RPGs.
So he had to kind of hold their hands a little bit. He had
Yeah.
to like really convince these people.
Yeah, and so from there, as people start reading those magazines, becoming, they start understanding what RPGs a little bit more. Maybe you're an arcade game maker. You're like, oh, that's really cool, and that's starting to become really popular. How could we like help people feel like they're role playing?
Yeah.
My dungeon crawler, more arcade-esque type game as like an additional appeal to it, as Pat's describing, a combination strategy. And that's directly where you start getting the action RPG genre emerging from that combination strategy.
That's so interesting.
So that's Panorama To, 1983, which led into things like Ys and the Legend of Heroes. Then you have Legend of the Holy Sword, Seiken Densetsu from Compaq, Heart of Fantasy.
Not that Seiken Densetsu. It's not the mana one, right?
So not Secret of Mana, obviously.
Yeah.
And then another funny one is Fantasian, 1985.
I saw that. Yeah. I was like, is it a remake? Is it a remake? No, it's totally different.
No, just the same name used again.
Yeah.
Courageous Perseus and Heart of Fantasy were
Heart of
1984. So these in the list: The Dragon and Princess, Underground Exploration, Spy Daisakuzen, Seduction of the Condominium Wives, Sword and Sorcery, Dungeon, Panorama To, Legend of the Holy Sword, Heart of Fantasy, and Courageous Perseus are all. It's an incomplete list, but a fairly, I would say, solid list of potential games that could qualify as the first JRPG.
Okay, very nice.
But that all have problems based on
All of
what
them,
we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Is it really an RPG or is it more of an arcade game? Is it really an RPG or more of a text-based adventure game? Did it really come before this one or not? But one of those games is probably it, and most of those games were made by Koei. Like more than half of them were made by Koei up through like 1983. So it's somewhere in that range. Now, here is where the J distinction, I think, actually begins to matter when you are defining what a JRPG is versus what Ultima is or Wizardry is. Right. Or even the Black Onyx, which is a really interesting one because the Black Onyx was made in Japan by a Westerner.
Right.
And so I think what a lot of people focus on, just in my estimation, I'm not saying this is like this is definitive. This is a conversation we're having with our audience, obviously, and you'll have perspectives I can learn from. But I think what people focus on a little too much is the geographical or ethnic sort of like aspect of J in there. Yeah. It has to be J only if it's made by some percentage, some larger majority of Japanese developers.
Right. And that makes it J.
And that makes it J. Or it has to have been made in Japan. But you get these really weird examples like Final Fantasy, where Nazir Gabelli is like the main freaking programmer of the game.
Yeah.
And he, from the beginning of that series, he lived in Sacramento, and a lot of Final Fantasy 2 and 3 were made in Sacramento.
Yeah, just
California.
Him. Yeah.
Because his work visa expired. He couldn't live in Japan anymore.
Oh, really?
But like that dude like programmed that game, and he's not Japanese, right? And there's lots of examples like that, like Hank Rogers. He's a Dutchman living in Japan, makes this game that's the first like truly successful RPG of its type in Japan. but the dude is not Japanese.
Yeah.
So there's all of these reasons why using those as ways of defining what a JRPG is muddy and also becomes contentious and is just not useful.
Right.
So to me, what really defines it better is the fact that we go back to the fact that Dungeons and Dragons did not release in Japan until 1985.
Right.
So there are Western influences, obviously, in the fact that these other PC games start becoming popular. But what else is inspiring Yuji Horii, Hironobu Sakaguchi, and these creators who sort of end up defining the formula for what a JRPG is? Well, it's manga and anime.
Yeah.
Yuji Horii worked at Weekly Shonen Jump.
Yeah, he was a writer, yeah.
For the magazine.
Yeah.
He had connections because of that with Akira Toriyama, the creator of Dragon Ball, the artist and character designer.
Yeah.
And
storyline wise,
yeah,
heavily influenced by manga.
I just talked about, I'll read this quote from Hironobu Sakaguchi, right, where he was all upset because like Dragon Quest gets all this free press and Weekly Shonen Jump because Yuji Horii works there. How unfair is that? It's bullcrap. And he can't get his game covered. And so he goes in to speak with the editor-in-chief. Source here is Edge Magazine, issue 314, page 68. I've got it right here next to me. I have referenced this magazine a lot in our previous podcasts. They have an excellent retrospective on Final Fantasy, the whole Final Fantasy series, up to the point of this issue releasing in 2017. That is full of interviews that give so much further insight than what we used to have previous to that, which were a lot of like internet interviews from 1UP and
just like sound bites, like brief interviews.
This has tons and tons of developers on the Final Fantasy series who all give really interesting perspectives that have changed a lot of my understanding about how that series was developed. So not getting too much into that, but that's where this quote comes from. So Hironobu Sakaguchi says, around that time, a very popular magazine, Shonen Jump, would feature a video game each week in its pages. I became obsessed with getting a Final Fantasy game into that slot, especially because Dragon Quest had monopolized the space. I went so far as to meet with the editor, Kazuhiko Torishima, to ask what could be done to be featured. He began teaching me how to create deep characters and backstories and what kinds of supporting characters you need to help bring the protagonists forward in the drama. That way, it would the way it would work is I would show my scripts and he would point everything he disliked. I'd go away and rewrite the script and eventually he'd maybe point out something that he thought was good. It was tough because I was essentially learning through criticism. Torishima has been instrumental in growing and mentoring some of Japan's best-known manga talents, and it was invaluable training. He basically taught me how to write stories.
Wow.
So we have
huge.
Two of the giants who essentially went on to define what a JRPG is, not in the use of the term, but in terms of the formula of how the games are designed. Both were mentored by the editor and chief of Weekly Shonen Jump.
Yeah.
How can manga and anime not be one of the biggest influences in sort of like understanding what that genre, JRPG, is about?
Yeah.
It's not about the ethnicity or the region. It's about the culture in which it came from. And the culture of PC nerds in the early 80s was otaku. If all of the D&D nerds who made the PC nerds who made Wizardry and Ultima were D&D nerds, all of the guys making the console JRPG in the mid to late 80s were otaku. That's like what they were. That's what they were that's what they were reading, what they were watching, what they were influenced by.
Yeah.
And Dragon Quest being sort of like the standard that sort of like began this tradition in force, had Dragon Ball's character designer and artist creating its visual aesthetic, a writer for Weekly Shonen Jump writing the story, and even the composer, Koichi Sugiyama, had written music for very popular anime films and shows during that time.
That's right, yeah.
Like Science Ninja Team Gatchaman and The Sea Prince and The Fire Child, and one I used to watch on, I think it was Toonami or Adult Swim growing up, Cyborg 009.
Oh, okay, nice.
That was an anime I really, really loved as a high schooler. And he was the composer of those anime.
No.
And so you have, I mean, just straight up manga anime influence on the most popular RPG coming from Japan of the 80s.
Yeah.
So to me, the J distinction, it's all about Japanese culture and particularly the media of the 80s, which was dominated by anime and manga. So when I ended up writing my sort of definition of what a JRPG is, I said, with all of that context, I think it's fair to say that a JRPG, like early Western RPGs, is a game in which players assume the role of characters in a fictional setting, making decisions that have a limited effect because of the digital portion of it, right? The limitations of the PCs and consoles they're made for, a limited effect on the story and character development. They also feature stats-based character progression, where player characters grow stronger as they level up and increase their attributes. However, JRPGs also tend to focus more on linear storytelling with established characters. This is very different from the Western tradition. You have a stat sheet. It is very detailed.
Yes.
And you fill in every freaking detail about who you are in this world.
Yeah, you have multiple 20-sided dice and big stat sheets to keep track of everything, and a whole general script for the dungeon master, like an outline kind of thing. And it's what it goes into to play one of these games is so far beyond what any RPG can really accomplish. It's just wild.
So this is what's so funny. There are two things that I think lead to the fact that JRPGs tend to not have that sort of extremely detailed blank slate character. Yeah. One is they were trying to make an RPG for a console. And so rather than having you go through and pick all that stuff, and it's not even just the limitation of the console, they wanted to make it more accessible anyways.
Yeah.
They were trying to simplify it as a design choice for the game. So rather than picking your attributes or your class or something like that in Dragon Quest, the name that you input determines your long-term stat growth. So depending on which characters you choose and in which order for the name of your character, it changes how quickly they'll gain an attribute like strength, over the course of leveling up. It'll either be slower or faster depending on the name you chose.
Interesting.
Right?
Huh.
So they dumb it, I don't want to say dumb it down, they simplify it in that sense, but also because these guys are anime manga writers and they're trying to write a story of a character that they've thought of and designed. So those two things together lead to this more linear storytelling focus with established characters that are inspired by manga and anime that also share the same sensibilities in aesthetics, storytelling, format, sound, and music. So that, to me, is what a JRPG is, and I was just about to pass it to you, Pat, to get your critique on my definition.
So no, I think that you are on the money, and I just have things to add.
Sure.
Right. So let me add the list first, and then we'll sort of look at the historical context of when the things you're talking about really started to emerge and become stronger. So you already said anime influenced instead of Tolkien influenced. That's because I want to compare them to Western RPGs. Western RPGs are dominated by Tolkien.
Yeah.
Because Gygax and Arneson, who created D&D, loved Tolkien.
Yep.
So the very, very Tolkien influence, but then in Japan, they're anime and manga influence. They're more linear and I say authorial, right? So that there's an author for a JRPG, and he says he has a vision, and whereas a Western RPG, you often have instead a world in which you can be the storyteller. And Gygax was very vocal about that being important, and it was actually Arneson's idea, but Gygax was always a champion of that, and Arneson was more of a reluctant press subject. But then there were other things that were different between the JRPGs, and this was emerging at the time, and Western RPGs. So Western RPGs, you tended to have a more customizable party, and party composition was a big tactical issue. And in JRPGs, that was less so. Sometimes you didn't have a party, like the early Dragon Quest games, but once you did, you had to have characters in your party, not archetypes. You didn't have a tank, a healer, a rogue necessarily in your party. You had to have the princess, your best friend, a fairy from the forest, right? Like these are people first. And again, job classes second, and that's very true of a JRPG. And eventually that became a problem in Final Fantasy IV, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the other things, and some of these are kind of not necessarily, you wouldn't expect them, but JRPGs tend to have, Western RPGs tend to have a low level cap, like level 20 is the max level, and levels are further apart. There's a lot of time between each character level, and each character level is very significant. Like if you level up once, you're going to be able to kill a boss that you couldn't kill before, because you gain a lot of power at each level. But in a JRPG, that's not true. There's more of a tall and thin level up system where you have 99 levels to gain, but each one is much less significant, and they also come a lot faster. And probably that was just because the consoles couldn't store tons of perks and feats on your character that a PC could, and also just it was just usability issues. It's like when you're in a Western RPG, you have to pick all your perks and feats for your character, and so you need a UI to do that. And Nintendo just never going to offer you the kind of UI a PC was with a mouse and a keyboard and all that stuff. So the tall and thin level up system became really important part of the JRPG identity. And then also Western RPGs tended to have fewer, longer battles. Because you needed to have all those tactical things. You had these cooldowns. You needed to get your tank out there and have him, enrage and draw aggro, and you want your healer to have time to recharge for second level heal, et cetera, et cetera. JRPGs, there's not as much of that. They probably did want to do it, but they just didn't have the memory space and the UI to make those customizable characters and with all their ability choices possible. So that they were trying their best, but they just simply could not make that work on Nintendo. So that's why you get many shorter battles where you do fewer things. Yeah. And that also then ties into the taller, thinner level up system where you don't make as many choices, but you are seeing a sense of progression. It's just very vertical. And yeah, those are the sort of emergent properties of JRPGs as compared to Western RPGs. But I think it's important to note that in the beginning, I do think that, except for the manga influence, which was just inevitable and subconscious and baked into the culture, I do think that the developers were really trying to make something like D&D. Maybe not Yuji Horii, but the Squaresoft team was very definitely trying to make something like D&D and hitting limitations. And only around 1991 and 92 did they really make a self-conscious effort to really pivot to a style that fit their medium, their culture, and the devices they were making games for.
I think when you view the term JRPG with the caveats that I've given and that you've added to now, basically you get a much more useful sort of like definition, right? Because, when we're saying a game from Japan, like Elden Ring is not a JRPG, that's very confusing to people. It's an RPG made in Japan by Japanese players, that's a JRPG. Yeah. It's not. But also, Pat's game, Quartet, is a JRPG.
It's like saying, the most famous French restaurant in the world is in California.
Yes.
And it's run by a man named Thomas Keller, right? Like French Laundry. It's considered the nicest restaurant in the world, but is it French cuisine? Is it Italian food if you buy it in America?
Yes.
It's a style.
Yeah. There's one more quote I wanted to read first, just to kind of solidify something. This comes from Takashi Tokita, who was an influential early developer at Squaresoft, mostly graphic designer earlier on, but then he became a director in his own right and did a lot of the story for Final Fantasy IV. I would call him the assistant director on Final Fantasy IV. Very I know nice. That term is not used outside of the film industry, but it's kind of what he was on Final Fantasy IV. And his take on this is this, and I think this is where it really came together for me. My personal take is that there were games like Ultima and Wizardry, and then DQ took those and added a Japanese manga-ish type to them, or a flair to them. And Final Fantasy added an animation taste, and that's where it kind of falls in the line of history. That's what a JRPG is.
Yeah. I would revise that line there, and Final Fantasy added an anime taste. because previously it's manga.
So I think what he's referring to with animation, this is actually really cool because the first JRPGs released by Enix and Squaresoft were not Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy on consoles. It was for Square. It was Cruise Chaser Blasty, a PC game that is
like Gundam,
incredibly complex from an animation standpoint.
Right.
Enix released another Gundam-esque, like mecha anime JRPG the year before Cruise Chaser Blasty. I have not played this one. I meant to before we started recording, but there wasn't enough time. It was called Earthfighter Ryza, 1985 for Earthfighter Ryza. And then Cruise Chaser Blasty was 1986. So each of these were 1 year before their flagship RPG series were made. And if you look, again, we talked about the complexity you could do with like PC RPGs in comparison. These looked really, really, really good.
Really?
Like Cruise Chaser Blasty's animations in the combat is like freaking unbelievable.
I have seen some of that. The really explosions cool. And it's pretty wild.
It's really cool.
And they got the anime studio behind Gundam to do the animations.
Nippon Sunrise.
Yeah.
They're called something different now, but at the time they were called Nippon Sunrise. And they made Gundam. And they did the mech designs for Cruise Chaser Blasty.
Yeah.
So the game, again, just another tie to manga and anime, right? And how influenced they were by that. And you just go back to all these games. Even you go back to some of the games we listed from the early 80s, 1982, 1983, and you look at like the characters from those Japanese games. Some of them
look quite good.
They're basically just anime characters from the beginning.
This is another thing I think we should bring up is that Japanese displays had higher resolution than American displays.
Yes.
And it's because Americans can get by reading the Roman alphabet fairly easily on a low-res display.
Right.
But Japanese kanji is very difficult to read unless you have higher resolution, unless you're just going to print it really tall, but then it's less efficient to read. So to get it to be newspaper print in terms of like DPI size, on the monitor, you just need a higher resolution screen. So Japanese resolution screens enabled them to have more complex animation and just graphics, just images, right? So a lot of the like title screens and things for these Japanese games looked way better than an American screen was even capable of displaying. So there was also a disconnect there as well, that the Japanese were kind of a little bit more advanced on the tech end than the Americans and were kind of taking things in their own direction that the Americans would kind of have to play catch up to later.
The combination of those things, this is actually part of the new retrospective series we're developing on the Final Fantasy series. For FF1 in particular, Squaresoft, when they started in like 1983, they were developing for these personal computers that were like more advanced. And they were really reluctant to make games for the Famicom. They were like, oh, this looks like a kid's toy.
Yeah.
And
we would have to dumb things down so much.
It's so limited in comparison to the cool stuff we can make on PCs. Right. And there is nothing that demonstrates how incredibly more advanced PCs were to those early consoles than Cruise Chaser Blasty right alongside Final Fantasy 1.
Yeah.
Final Fantasy 1 having released a year later.
Yeah,
and at this time, even a year,
graphics were
advancing really fast.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
And Cruise Chaser Blasty is in an entirely another universe in terms of like visual aesthetics and graphics and animation than something like Final Fantasy is. So when he says animation, I think it can mean two things. I think it can refer to anime, but also Square really prioritized their animation quality in their games.
Yeah.
So like Dragon Quest, for instance, and actually almost all early JRPGs, which were derived from those early PC RPGs, had a front view, first person battle system with very limited animation, if any at all. Dragon Quests, they might have a slash that comes across the screen on a single enemy sitting in a little, background or whatever. And you have, sound effects and things like that that suggest damage, the hit landed and then all the text that explains what's going on. Final Fantasy did a side view battle system in which you see the characters move forward, have an animation for an attack that changes depending on the context of which equipment they have.
Weapon, Did
they use a magic spell? Did they have a bow and arrow, or did they use an axe, or did they use a sword, or did they use a club, or did they use something else? And like all those animations changed based on that context. So that was very advanced for the Famicom. Like no other games in terms, I'm not talking about arcade games, but RPGs were doing that. And they really stressed the importance of the animation and the visual quality. And this has kind of become something that I think we could also add to what makes a JRPG, are those roots in animation coming again from anime, right?
Yeah.
Like the roots in putting a big emphasis on impressive animation.
Yeah.
And this would lead to something like the later Persona games, for instance, having those really insane, very flashy, cool animations between all its menus and all its attacks and passing the turn and all this stuff. That's something that has, I think, also been kind of baked into the foundation of what makes a JRPG. And all the way through the 90s, certainly, and into the early 2000s, Western developers of RPGs commonly commented on how they were getting their butts kicked by Japanese developers in these categories.
Yeah.
Like, they are visually way more impressive. They're doing a lot more with their like character interactions. Final Fantasy VII was referenced, I think, by the lead developer of Baldur's Gate 2 as being an inspiration for the direction they sort of went with Baldur's Gate 2. He's looking at Final Fantasy VII. He's just like, holy crap, dude! Like, they're doing this stuff that is just like leagues above us.
Yeah.
And this is a big part of why our next episode, which is the golden age of RPGs, is called that, is because Japan dominated this genre for like more than a decade and way surpassed in terms of like, not in terms of complexity like we're talking about, right? But that was the answer. See, Square wanted to make the more complex stuff, but the answer was accessibility. That's what sold. That's what like really took off and latched on with people. And so I think Western RPGs were way more complex than JRPGs all through the late 80s and 90s.
And that is why they weren't
not nearly as successful.
Yeah.
It was I don't want to use the term dumbing down. I don't think it is that. It's just in simplifying, making it more accessible to someone who's never played a game like this before.
Yeah, yeah.
That blew that genre up in terms of its popularity. Do you have a comment on that, Pat?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that goes into this, and I always like to talk about historical context, it's that at the time in the United States, in Canada, there was like 3 animation studios, one of which was very small. You had Disney, you had Bluth, and I think there's one more that I'm not thinking of.
Don Bluth. That's right. He did All Dogs Go to Heaven, right?
Oh, yeah.
Right.
And Don Bluth. He lives here in Utah, actually.
There were very few animation studios and personnel who were trained and available. Animation as a medium was simply not as big a thing in the United States as it was in Japan. And so they have this very robust environment in which lots and lots of people were trained as animators, even mid-level animators. And that just made it possible to have greater animation technology, better workflows, cheaper labor. And so you have all these, animators who are reasonably skilled can go over to games, especially as the anime industry collapsed. It collapsed in the 90s in terms of like the amount of money that could be earned. This can be seen in things like Evangelion, how like the first season of Evangelion had a much bigger budget than the second. Because the industry was sort of imploding. But all those people were cast off by animation studios in Japan and then landed at video game companies.
Yep.
And so that is a big historical contextual reason why you can have, fairly robust graphics on fairly minor titles, right? It's just there's this glut of talent, and they can figure out ways to get it onto devices because they have, the personnel who can, I'll reduce the color palette of this drawing down to 8 colors. Fine, that's a challenge, and I have the time, and you have the labor, and I need this job, and I have experience. So it just, with the talents available, then they'll figure out a way.
This is not a role-playing game by any means, but it is, I think, an example of a similar kind of thing that Pat is talking about right now in terms of like Japan, again, cultural context explaining why this occurred, but why Japanese developers were making far more advanced looking games than a lot of their Western counterparts in sort of these early console eras. One of my favorite video games growing up was Tecmo Super Bowl.
Oh, yeah.
Tecmo Super Bowl is I think the first NFL like licensed sports game where they could actually use the actual logos and the NFL teams and the names of players and the current rosters and the current schedules and all those kinds of things that are now commonplace in games like Madden and things like that. But before this, that was not the case. But what was so special about Tecmo Super Bowl was its huge anime flair. So like when you throw a pass and you have the two sprites running to the ball and they're close together, they would show an anime style flashy cutscene of the one guy jumping up to catch and it goes through his hands and the other guy comes down with it and you like see him and it's done in frames like a manga.
Oh yeah, that's right, like a manga.
And it's like and there's this incredibly exciting music on every play. It's like dun, 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 dun. And it's like driving and it just makes it so exciting. It is basically the NFL as an anime or as a manga or something like that with music and sound effects. Yeah. And you have the ref come up and he does this big animation for like touchdown and the crowd's going crazy and they have the halftime shows with like all this animation quality was unbelievable.
That's crazy.
And you look at anything else as a sports title made in that same year by American companies and it's like the most blah in terms of presentation, just like boring, straightforward, minimalist kind of feel to it.
Yeah.
And so this is essentially what I would say is the reason, the explanation for why the golden age of RPGs is called that. It's not that, the games from 1990s are better than the games from the 2010s or whatever in terms of like RPG quality, the quality of the game. It's more about how amazing Japanese titles were in comparison to their Western counterparts in terms of like presentational quality, accessibility, just how much Western gamers, kids latched onto those titles from Japan. Now, the only caveat to this is a lot of titles we didn't get because the localization aspect of it was so complicated and expensive, and a lot of times they didn't deem like it was worth doing. Yeah. So there are so many JRPG titles that have long-running franchises in Japan that either have never, ever seen the light of day in the West or maybe just recently have maybe one title that's come out in 2018 or something like that.
Isn't that so strange?
Yeah.
There's like, there's an alternate universe. It's like a whole nother world. It's like, I want to play those games,
Yeah.
Like, how come we haven't played those games? And to that point too, a ton of these games from the 80s that were made are to this day still not translated into English.
Yeah.
Even some of the minimal ones. A lot of the games, even like on this list that we have, it's like there isn't like like Heart of Fantasy or there's just a ton of these games. It's like there's no English version of that game, right?
It doesn't exist.
You learn Japanese or you don't get to play it.
Yeah. Squaresoft, I know we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here, but they had a slew of really great RPGs on the Super Nintendo that never saw the light of day. Bahamut Dragoon, Rudra no Hiho, Treasure Hunter G.
I've heard of that.
There's a whole Live Alive that has now finally kind of like been remade and released in the West. Yeah, on the Switch, I believe.
Another interesting thing to note is that Square Enix is like I think the largest manga publisher to this day in Japan.
Yeah,
and so they just go side by side. They go together.
Yeah,
I've seen. I think it was even a Legend of Zelda manga that I'd seen that was published or printed by Square Enix, and I was like, it's very interesting.
Yeah, big part of their business. All of this historical, cultural context leads us up to the properties and the publishers that would now, having been influenced by those games we've talked about, would establish the Bible, so to speak, the formula for how JRPGs have been made ever since.
This Bible. This is how I will define JRPGs.
Yes,
is it like these 5 games?
This is why I consider
any other definition is a little too tricky. I think this is it. Is it like these 5 games?
This is why I personally consider Dragon Quest to be the first JRPG.
Yeah.
Even though if you get into all the technicalities,
it wasn't first.
You could say it's not first, and it was inspired by this and this game. But in terms of like it being the first console JRPG, which is again a big part of like what made them the way they are because of the constraints of that 8-bit console.
Yeah.
It basically laid the foundation for how they're made ever since. So I don't care what anyone says, Dragon Quest to me is the first like true JRPG.
Yeah, it's Genesis.
That's where it starts. It's where it really all begins. So that's 1986. And of course, actually funny enough, we talk about how insanely popular Dragon Quest is obviously in Japan and how it was this mega success. It had exactly the same problem as Black Onyx. They released the game and it wasn't selling at all.
I heard that too, and I never knew. I thought it was a smash hit day one. I always thought that. It was not the case.
Nope.
They had to convince people to love Dragon Quest.
Yuji Horii happened to work at Weekly Shonen Jump.
Yes, that's it.
So that helped a lot. But in addition to that, he went out to all these other PC magazines and said, "Got to try this game. Look at the article that was written in Shonen Jump by me about it. Check it out. This is cool." And then, like, as other publications began picking it up, Famitsu being a big one. You know, then like it starts becoming this huge seller. Dragon Quest in Japan alone. Now these are crazy numbers today, right?
Yeah.
For a console RPG, but this is 1986. 1.5 million copies of the first game in Japan
in just a few months, I think. Yeah.
Dragon Quest 3 in Japan on the Famicom sold 3 million copies in its first week on the market.
That's crazy. That is so crazy.
Like freaking unbelievable success, right? And this is, so once it becomes that.
That's genre-defining material, right there.
Yes, exactly. But once it becomes that, of course, you're going to see a bunch of other people trying to take advantage of that trend, and we can make a game like that. Final Fantasy came directly on the back of that. They're quoted, Sakaguchi quoted as saying, "We can make a game that'll sell more than Dragon Quest." They were all about chasing Dragon Quest. So, Dragon Quest 1986, but like there's sort of like 5 pillars, I would call them.
That's if you invoked Bible earlier, so that's the Pentateuch. Sure. This is the law.
Yes,
this is the 5 books of Moses.
Exactly, the 5 books of Moses of JRPGs.
The 5 books
are as follows: Enix with its Dragon Quest series, particularly 1987 is the year where this is set in stone. Yeah, is the year that Moses comes back with the, the 10 Commandments from Mount Sinai.
Well, it's funny because Ultima 3, which inspired a lot of this, was called Exodus, which is just wonderful.
So you have Dragon Quest and then Dragon Quest 2 in 1987.
Yeah, which the difference being Dragon Quest 2 introduced the party mechanics. Yeah,
so that's Enix.
2 Dragon Quest. Yeah,
probably call them the cornerstone.
Yeah, there you go.
Then you have Squaresoft with Final Fantasy. Then you have Sega with Phantasy Star. Now, this is a really interesting one.
And it's probably the best looking one.
Yes, it is because it's not a Nintendo game.
Oh, that's right. Sega Master System.
Sega Master System.
Which released later and had some slightly better hardware.
It visually was way superior.
It was faster, I know that. That's why Sonic was so big, because they were like, we can process graphics faster.
Yes.
What do we do? Oh, Sonic fast. Got to go fast.
Yeah. So Phantasy Star was Sega's answer to this very rapidly emerging new genre that people really like.
Yeah.
And was like, we want a game like that, but we got to differentiate ourselves from what they're doing.
Yeah.
How can we be different? The answer was
it's more sci-fi-ish.
Science fiction.
Yeah.
And so like you get this like sci-fi branch of the JRPG that sort of like gets its origins in Phantasy Star. And one really interesting part of the development of that game is they were really inspired by Star Wars because they thought Star Wars was cool and how it combined Western sort of like mythos and what'd you call it, like the hero's journey type archetypes with Japanese imagery. The kendo looking sort of like stuff that the Jedi would wear. And then they, at that time, they wielded their lightsabers very much like katana. This was before the prequels when they're freaking flipping around and like dual wielding crap.
And George Lucas was very intentional in that because Mark Hamill was like, "Hey, I can do cool stuff with this. Wouldn't it look cool?" And George Lucas always told him, "No, you gotta hold it with 2 hands.
It's supposed to be heavy."
Yeah, that's right.
He was like the lightsaber's heavy in your hands. And it's like cumbersome to wield it, and so that's what made Darth Vader look more powerful.
He was
doing it with one hand.
Yeah, that's right.
So anyway, very different. But Phantasy Star developers were inspired by that mixture of the sort of like Japanese and Western influences. Yeah. And they wanted to kind of do something similar in bringing it back to a Japanese game, but has these sci-fi elements and kind of inspired by the West in certain ways. And so Phantasy Star became another one of those pillars. So those are 3 pillars so far.
Yeah, Phantasy Star also had a female protagonist, which differentiated it quite a bit from the others.
That was a very intentional choice by them as well. Then you have Ys from Neon Falcom.
Yeah, that was fun. I played that just yesterday.
Yeah, Ys is great.
It's hard, but it's wonderful.
Ys is really, really cool. It has like this bump kind of like combat
you just kind
to
of
it. You just run into enemies, but you need to do it at kind of like an angle rather than just like head on kind of thing.
Because then they hit you.
So you can't
stop. If you stop, you die.
This is the pillar I'm talking about in terms of the action RPG branch, right?
Yeah.
Ys and Dragon Slayer before it sort of like pioneered in that direction.
Yeah.
Now, Dragon Slayer had a bunch of action RPG releases until the 6th, so Dragon Slayer 6, which was subtitled The Legend of Heroes.
Yes.
And what it did was it took the turn-based and command-based elements of the other branch
Final
of RPGs
Fantasy,
and put it into Dragon Slayer.
Right.
And that's what led to The Legend of Heroes, which is Trails in the Sky and Trails of Cold Steel and all those sort of games you might know today. So that's Neon Falcom and Ys / Dragon Slayer as that 4th pillar. And then as the 5th, I would add Atlas with Digital Devil Saga, Megami Tensei.
Yeah, this one's different. This one's a little more on the wizardry kind of end, the dungeon crawling kind of aspect. Feels a little more arcadey.
Yeah. If you go back, so, a lot of Persona and Atlas as a developer did not really blow up into like mainstream success until 2016's Persona 5.
Yeah.
Everything they made before that was niche and it was very cool, but there was a long legacy of changes to this series that led into what Persona is now. Persona is an offshoot of Shin Megami Tensei, which is itself sort of an offshoot of this Digital Devil Saga Megami Tensei, which was based on a trilogy of, I think, light novels or something like that from Japan at the time. And there were actually 2 attempts to adapt the Megami Tensei, those novels, into video games. Atlas's version here is the one that like stuck and took off, but there was another company that made a very different type of game too. But
they both came out in the same year though, right?
Same year on different platforms.
This was weird for me researching because I thought I had discovered, Megami Tensei 1987, perfect. And I kind of got a feel for the gameplay. And it wasn't until this morning that in my, I actually read your Google Doc here, the show notes, and I was like, there were 2? Okay, which one are we talking about then? And then I found the dungeon crawler one. So the other one was like a top-down looking kind of mazy kind of thing. But the dungeon crawler one is the one that stuck. That's the Atlas one, right? So I'm glad I did that because I was looking at the wrong one. Yeah,
that led into Shin Megami Tensei, which always had, and still has, even to this day, and the latest release would be Shin Megami Tensei 5.
Okay.
A very heavy dungeon crawling aspect to it. And it's tough. And like getting through dungeons can be grueling and long, and you need to like persuade monsters to fight with you instead of trying to fight everything. And you got to manage your items and inventory really well. So that's always been kind of the legacy of Shin Megami Tensei. Now there was a break off, and we'll get way more into this in the next episode, where you have this Persona offshoot. But all the way back to Digital Devil Saga Megami Tensei, they had that sort of high schooler as the main protagonist, the high schooler and his girlfriend.
That's right.
Who, like, go to fight demons.
yes, which is similar to Persona, right?
Yes.
And it's he was on a computer and it's a digital devil story. So he through his computer he accidentally opened a portal and like literally Lucifer comes and like starts to cause trouble on Earth, and he's got to go battle the digital devils.
So that side of that original Digital Devil Saga kind of became more of what Persona focused on, is that high school kind of like drama aspect.
Like balancing your life.
You got a little bit of the dating sim elements and balancing your life with the fact you're fighting freaking demons. But so that's the 5th pillar. So to go back over, Enix, Dragon Quest, Square, Final Fantasy, Sega with Phantasy Star, Neon Falcom with Ys and Dragon Slayer, and then Atlas with Digital Devil Saga. These 5 more or less would go on to make every major JRPG franchise that you have ever heard of, outside of a few caveats to that, like Nintendo with Fire Emblem and that whole offshoot of the tactical RPG.
Yeah.
We'll get into that next time.
or like Earthbound,
maybe something like Mother Earthbound,
that's it,
right? Though that's not like a successful running franchise. They kind of like have stopped making those, unfortunately. And then of course you have Wolf Team, now known as I think it's Namco Tales of Studio or something like that.
Okay,
that makes the Tales of games.
Yeah, Fantasia.
Right? But outside of like a few of those, any big RPG that you know of either was published by this group of five or by developers who left this group of five to do their own thing. Like Xenogears being a Squaresoft property and Xenoblade and Xenosaga having Tetsuya Takahashi left one of the big five, Squaresoft.
Right.
And now, though, I mean, Nintendo essentially is the publisher of Xenoblade. So
Monolith is basically a second.
We can throw Nintendo in there as like a support pillar somewhere.
Yeah, but they weren't as they were big for the publishing aspect, for the making it accessible, and less so for the making it themselves.
Yes, exactly.
Because even Mario RPG was made by Square.
Anything you would like to add to that, Pat?
In terms of the historical framing, like I agree with all that, the five pillars. But just going towards the next episode and understanding the transition and historical period. Those games that we talked about at the time were still closer to D&D than they were to what would come later, right? So like Final Fantasy 1 and the early Dragon Quest were much closer to something like Wizardry or directly to D&D than they would be to Final Fantasy 7 or Dragon Quest 8.
Very good point. So I like that.
Yeah, these games are going to transform, and really the inflection point historically that I see as the clearest is a Final Fantasy 4, and that's a point where you talked about a quote from Tokita, and I want to actually expand that quote. I think it's Tokita, so it's not entirely clear, but in the Ultimania for Final Fantasy 4. Whoever it was, because again, it's not always clear who's being quoted there, said that we want to make Final Fantasy IV like a cinematic masterpiece, like something you'd see in a movie, where the characters come in and there's lots of different characters come in. There's an ensemble drama, there's epic stakes, there's a real story and a real character arcs, and to do that, they had to make certain compromises with sort of the pillar, the bedrock of RPGs, which is your job classes. So like, from D&D onward, every game had all these job classes, and you need to compose your party carefully and have your tank, healer, mage combo. And that was probably the most common thing you saw in RPGs. It was the defining characteristic of most RPGs. But in Final Fantasy IV, they had a lot of trouble doing that because they had party members coming in and out of the party a lot. And so even though Final Fantasy IV is not super hard, it is very uneven because of all the party members who enter and exit. So like the game, like you never, your party's composition really solidifies late in the game when you get your core five team members. But before that, you have all these people coming in, Purim and Param, Tella, Rosa enters and leaves, Kane enters and leaves. So you have everybody coming in and leaving for gimmick dungeons, and it's fun. It's a lot. The story works, and they definitely accomplished what they wanted to do. But it did show them that going to the next era of JRPGs, and the reason why this happened was that they were going to have to make bigger artistic compromises on the traditional roots of RPGs in order to achieve the storytelling goals that they would continue to set out for themselves. So the next era, we're going to see a lot of that pivoting away from the standard or the orthodox parts of D&D towards a new vision.
Yeah, I think that's a really good setup for essentially where the launching point for our next episode will be. As Dragon Quest was in terms of its level of influence on what JRPGs were in the 8-bit era, Final Fantasy IV was that for the 16-bit era.
Yeah.
I would say Dragon Quest V as well, but Final Fantasy IV did the story on the level that Pat's talking about first. And Dragon Quest, in that particular aspect, followed it with its generational storytelling. You have a kid who's like going with his father to he becomes a man himself and then has his own kids. 3 generations of storytelling in that. So it's very cool and robust in that way too. But Final Fantasy IV, I think, really began a new kind of tradition in the way that JRPGs would be developed moving forward. Let's call it an evolution. So it was trailblazing in a big way there. That would then lead to the JRPG not only being a mainstream in Japan, but becoming a mainstream globally. With a game I'm sure you all know what I'm referring to, but we'll save it for then. That's teaser for next episode. Thanks for joining us, Pat. Appreciate you as always. Always love having you on. Any final thoughts you had?
No, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, that's great. Okay, two things. Go check out Pat's reverse design series. They're great. I have read them. I learned a lot from them. And if you're particularly into, say, Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy VII, those books, I think, are essential reading. You did a really, really good job of breaking them down and analyzing them. But also, Quartet. Check out Quartet on Steam, soon to be Switch, right? When is the Switch release?
We hope by the end of the year, but if not, early next year on Switch. Switch is increasingly hard to develop for.
Yes.
An NDA tells me I can't explain any further.
Okay.
So there will be a console version coming out towards the end of the year, but Quartet is available now on Steam. It is really good. It has gotten excellent reviews. I have played it.
Yeah,
we talked
too.
about it a bit with Pat a few weeks back. I think it's really, really well done. You guys should be super proud of what you made. So go check out Quartet. Links to these things will be in description. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.